When I was 13, my family moved from Boston to this small, sleepy coastal town in Maine. Our new home, nestled between the dense woods and rugged coastline, felt like a world away from the hustle of city life or anything even remotely close to that. Our 3-acre property was very private, with neighbors scattered far apart. On our second night in the new house, our dog Max woke me up in the middle of the night barking and growling. I couldn't tell what he was looking at since he seemed to be pointing towards a corner of the room. I checked the closet, but it was empty, so I patted Max on the head, and he settled down. However, several times throughout the night, I could feel him lift his head, seemingly reacting to something. The next day, we had our first visitor. My dad answered the door while I was in the family room watching television. My dad told me to come over and introduce myself, so I did. He was an elderly man named Peter who said he lived next door. He and my dad chatted for a few minutes while I listened. He was nice enough, if not a little weird, even by the standards of a 13-year-old. But since we were new to the area, I figured this was typical of the folks around here. The following day, I sat in the backyard playing Minecraft on my Nintendo Switch. My dad was gardening in the front yard, and the rest of my family had gone into town. Suddenly, Peter appeared, as if out of nowhere, donning an old fisherman's hat and speaking with a thick Maine accent. He asked me what I was up to as he sat across from me at the table. Even though no fence separated our houses, the fact that he walked right into our backyard immediately made me uncomfortable. But again, maybe this is how neighbors did things around here. I told him I was playing Minecraft, and he started mentioning stuff about building and crafting as if trying to bond with me. As he spoke, I realized something was definitely off about this guy. My dad then came to the backyard and saw Peter sitting with me. He smiled and said hello, but based on his face and tone, I could tell that he was a little unsettled by what Peter was doing in our backyard. He then told me to go inside and help my sister unpack some boxes. I knew my sister had gone into town with our mom, and he was just trying to get me away from this guy. A few minutes later, my dad came inside and asked me if Peter had just walked into our yard, and I said, yeah. That's when he told me he didn't want me around that guy anymore, and to let him know if I saw him again. A few nights later, I woke up to Max growling and barking again. This time, he was looking out the window. I got up to peer out but didn't see anything. I opened the window a little bit to hear if something was going on out there, and I immediately hear Peter making little chirping sounds in his creepy old man voice. I sprinted for my parents' room, yelling for my dad. When I told him Peter was outside my room, he stormed out to investigate. He looked all around our property but couldn't find him. The next morning, my dad went over to Peter's house to confront him. When he knocked on the door, an older woman answered and claimed she had no idea who Peter was. So my dad went by every single neighbor on the street, and not a single one of them had ever heard of the guy. My dad then called the police to report the man, and they said they would be on the lookout for him. We never saw or heard from Peter again, or so we thought. One evening, as autumn made its way into Maine, bringing with it the early chill and the colorful leaves, something happened that reopened the chapter we thought had closed. I was in my room. The memory of Peter nearly faded, engrossed in another world on my Nintendo Switch, when Max, who had been lying quietly by my feet, suddenly perked up and trotted over to the window, his ears pitched forward in alert. Curious, I paused my game and followed him, peering out into the twilight that cloaked our backyard. At first, I saw nothing, the darkness blending everything into shadows. But then, just as I was about to turn away, a figure emerged from the tree line at the edge of our property. The figure stood still, almost one with the trees, but there was no mistaking the outline of that old fisherman's hat and the slight hunch of his shoulders. Frozen, I watched as the figure lifted a hand and waved slowly, a chill running down my spine. Before I could react, the shape turned and disappeared back into the woods, as silently as he had appeared.
I was pretty excited to be moving into this new home I was leasing. It was a new construction, and I'd be the first resident to live there. I loved the place, except for my neighbor across the street. I saw him staring at me every time I walked out the front door. He was a middle-aged guy who never seemed to leave his house. I tried to ignore it at first, assuming he was just curious about the new person in the neighborhood. But the more I saw him, the more I realized there was just something off about the guy. He never spoke to anyone, he never smiled, and he seemed to never leave. He just stayed in his house, always watching. I would even catch glimpses of him through my window and see him standing in his driveway at odd hours of the night. Honestly, he was really creeping me out, big time. One night, as I was settling in for bed, I heard a noise outside, a scraping sound. I peeked out, and there he was, dragging a ladder across his yard in the middle of the night. What the heck, right? It was really late, and I had no idea why he would need to do work on his house at this hour. Red flags waving, I tried to shake off the paranoia, but failed miserably. Eventually, I calmed myself down and fell asleep. Early the next morning, I saw him outside again. This time, the dude is standing at the end of my driveway, staring at me through my window. I pulled the curtain shut and tried to ignore him, but the feeling of him watching me was just too unsettling. I didn't like that he was almost in my driveway either. I got into my car and pulled out of the garage, but he was back in his yard by then. I saw him staring at me in the rearview mirror as I drove off down the street. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I heard someone walking in my backyard. Mind you, my yard was completely fenced in. I got up to look out the window, but the footsteps had stopped by then. I went back to bed and waited, but didn't hear any more noise. Still, I got up again and checked the window just to be safe. It was hard to make him out because it was so dark, but someone was definitely standing there, watching me. I grabbed the phone and called the police, but whoever that was, they left before the cops arrived. I told them all about my creepy neighbor, but they told me there was no evidence of any wrongdoing and that my neighbor had never been in trouble with the law. I was basically on my own unless something more serious actually happened. After that, I started taking precautions. I put up some cameras and always double-checked the locks on my doors and windows. I'd only been in my new place less than a week, but I even thought about just breaking my lease. That creep across the street was definitely getting to me. Then, one night, I got home from work pretty late. I was exhausted and just went straight to bed. Around midnight, I heard a thud against the side of my house that jolted me awake. It sounded like it was right outside my bedroom window, which was on the second floor. Heart hammering, I peek out my window, and there he is. Mr. Peeper, the neighbor from across the street. He's on a ladder, staring directly into my bedroom, just inches from me. I yelled, and he quickly climbed down and ran away. I called the police again, and within a few minutes, they catch him trying to get the ladder down. They arrest him and haul him away. A few days later, one of my neighbors stopped by and said they, too, had some creepy encounters with the guy. They said they also saw him looking through their windows when they were coming home from work one day. I had hoped that catching my neighbor red-handed would end my nightmare. For a fleeting moment, as the police led him away, I let myself believe that. And then, one night, as the world outside my window drifted into darkness, I heard it again. The unmistakable sound of someone in my backyard. Heart pounding, I approached the window. the memory of his face, inches away from my own, flashing through my mind. Peering into the night, I searched for a figure, a shadow, anything. But there was nothing. Just the whisper of the wind and the rustle of leaves. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, my paranoia getting the best of me. As I turned away from the window, a soft thud echoed from the front of the house. Frozen, I listened as it was followed by another, then another, deliberate and measured. My mind raced with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. I edged towards the front door with a deep breath, peering through the peephole into the inky night beyond. What I saw sent a shiver down my spine. On my doorstep was a ladder, just like the one my neighbor had used. But this time, there was no one in sight. The implications hung in the air, heavy and ominous. Since my neighbor was still in custody, who had left the ladder there? I never found out. I broke the lease and moved out a few days later.
A few years back, during a rough patch at work, I found myself moving into this apartment complex to save money. The place was tucked away in the heart of this super quiet neighborhood, populated mainly by retirees enjoying their golden years without the hassle of a big house to look after. As I was lugging my life in boxes up the stairs, I caught a glimpse of another young person peeking out from one of the windows. A girl so stunning, I mentally placed her way out of my league, especially considering my non-existent dating life thanks to my all-consuming job. After moving in, I noticed that I often would see the woman looking at me when I would come or go from the parking lot. I just assumed that she was nosy or something like that, and didn't think for 1 second that she had any interest in me. One afternoon after work, when I stopped in the store to grab some dinner, I ended up physically running into the girl who had been staring at me for a few days now. Literally, I mean that we physically collided with each other. In a nervous voice, she said, "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I'm just an idiot sometimes." I started to say it was okay, but stopped when I realized who it was. Once everything clicked, I said, "Hey, are you the girl that lives in my building?" She smiled and blushed and then said, "Yeah, that's me." We made small talk for a while right there in the store, and that then evolved into a real conversation. Finally, I gathered the courage to ask if she wanted to come over for dinner tonight, since we were practically neighbors. She smiled and looked thrilled by the offer. She accepted and said that she would be over at around 7, and we exchanged numbers and went about our shopping. I was so excited and nervous about my date with this very attractive neighbor. I realized that I only had about an hour to clean my apartment and get ready. I was admittedly a train wreck. I even remember while I was straightening up, I got a text from her that said, "I can't wait for tonight," with a heart. Before I knew it, it was 7, and she was knocking on my door. The first several hours were amazing. We talked, ate dinner, had some wine, and just had a great evening. I felt like this was my first real adult date, and I was proud of how well it was all going. As it got late in the evening, I was ready for bed. This was a weeknight after all, and I had to work the next day. I sensed she wasn't ready to end the night, but I stood firm, not wanting to rush things. She was understanding, and we said goodnight around 11 p.m. when I walked her to her door, which was just a few apartments down from mine. I kissed her goodnight, and she smiled. I was pretty stoked. Waking up for a 1 a.m. bathroom break, I noticed a shadow under my front door, a shape that suggested someone was standing right outside. I figured it was my tired eyes just playing tricks on me, so I didn't worry too much. After the bathroom, when I walked by the door again, I noticed that the obstruction to the light was still there. I quietly went over to the door and looked through the peephole. The girl with whom I had just shared an entire evening was standing right outside. She looked like she was mumbling something under her breath, but I wasn't sure. So I watched for a few seconds. She didn't move at all. I snuck back into my room and grabbed my phone. I made sure that it was silent and went back to the door. I texted her phone and said, Hey, I can't sleep, but I just wanted to let you know that I had a great time tonight. Seconds later, she grabbed her phone from her pocket and with no expression on her face, she responded with, "Me too," with an exclamation point. "I can't wait to see you again." I waited for a moment and then sent another text that said, "I'm surprised you're awake. What are you up to?" Her response turned the butterflies in my stomach to stone when she texted back, "Oh, just lying in bed watching Netflix." I couldn't understand why she was standing there and lying about it. I didn't respond right away. I had no idea what to say to this woman or how to approach a situation like this. While I was thinking of something to say, she texted me again, this time saying, "If you want, I can come back, or you can come here," followed by a bunch of emojis. I didn't know how to reply to that. Meanwhile, she texted me again saying, "You have nothing to be afraid of." If I wasn't before, I was now. I finally sent a simple text that just read, "Thanks for the offer, but I'm really tired." I looked back out at her as she read the message, and still with no expression on her face, she put the phone back in her pocket and looked right at the peephole. I knew she couldn't see me, but the horror that I felt when I sorta made eye contact with the woman through the door was almost indescribable. Her eyes looked cold. I have no idea what her intentions were, but I just felt like they weren't good. I know I'm not good at dating, but I do know standing outside someone's door in the middle of the night, motionless, is not normal behavior. I decided to text her one last time and said, "Hey, did you hear anything funny in the hall? I thought I heard a knock on my door." This was my poor attempt to try and fish something out of her, at least elicit some reaction. She looked at the text for a minute, then back at the peephole with her cold eyes as if she knew I was there. She texted me one last time saying, "You're a smart boy, very smart, sleep tight." After about 5 minutes of just standing there, she turned around and went back to her apartment. I texted her the next day, but she never responded. Oddly, even though she lived just a few doors down, I never saw or heard from her ever again. Thanks for watching, and please subscribe.